Jack had always been drawn to the sea. When he found the listing for a temporary lighthouse keeper position on a remote island, it seemed like the perfect escape. The lighthouse was ancient, perched on jagged cliffs overlooking the endless expanse of ocean. Locals called it the Keeper's Grave, though they never explained why. He brushed off the ominous nickname as mere superstition. The job was straightforward: keep the light burning, monitor the weather, and ensure ships passed safely by the rocky coastline. His arrival was greeted with a heavy fog that hung over the island like a shroud, dampening the sunlight and casting an eerie stillness over the landscape. The lighthouse loomed tall and foreboding, its whitewashed walls scarred by years of salt and storm. Inside, it was cold and musty, filled with the scent of seawater and old wood. The only signs of life were seagulls circling overhead, their cries mingling with the wind's howl. Jack climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room, where the massive Fresnel lens stood like a silent guardian over the sea. He spent the first few hours settling in, checking the equipment, and familiarizing himself with the controls. It was all routine, mechanical, and helped keep his mind off the unsettling isolation. The wind outside picked up as dusk fell, rattling the glass panes of the lantern room. He flicked on the light, watching as its beam cut through the thickening fog, casting an ethereal glow across the churning waves. The job was simple, he reminded himself. Nothing to worry about here. But as the night deepened, a sense of unease crept in. The lighthouse, with its narrow corridors and shadowy corners, felt too quiet, too still. The wind outside grew stronger, howling like a living creature as it whipped around the tower. Jack dismissed his discomfort as mere nerves. It was only his first night, after all. He poured himself a cup of coffee, settling into a chair to watch the sea. Hours passed, and just as he began to nod off, he heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. His eyes snapped open, scanning the room. There was no one there. Only the empty lantern room and the flickering light overhead. Jack shrugged off the sound as his imagination playing tricks on him. Spending the night alone in a creaky old lighthouse could do that to anyone. But as he settled back into his chair, the whispering returned. It was faint, barely audible over the howling wind outside, yet distinct, a murmur, like a distant voice calling from the darkness. He strained his ears, trying to make out the words, but they were garbled, like a message carried through deep water. A shiver ran down his spine. He got up and paced the room, checking every corner, peering into the shadows that gathered around the lantern's base. Nothing. The room was empty, save for the steady hum of the light overhead. Just the wind, he muttered to himself, though the unease in his stomach told him otherwise. He descended the spiral staircase, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The lower levels were dark, the air growing colder as he ventured deeper into the heart of the lighthouse. He checked each floor methodically: storage rooms, the living quarters, the generator room. All were empty, just as they should be. But as he made his way back up, the whispering grew louder. It seemed to seep through the walls, echoing through the narrow corridor, rising and falling with the wind outside. Back in the lantern room, he found the whispers waiting for him. They swirled around him, indistinct and unsettling, like the voices of the sea itself. For a moment, he thought he caught a word, a name. His name. He froze, heart pounding in his chest. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky, breaking the silence that followed. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving the room in heavy silence. Jack stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his skin prickling with fear. He was alone, and yet he wasn't. Something was here, watching him from the shadows. The next morning, Jack tried to shake off the events of the previous night. It had to be his imagination, he reasoned. The wind, the isolation, the eerie atmosphere of the lighthouse. It was enough to unsettle anyone's nerves. As daylight broke over the horizon, he felt a surge of relief. Everything seemed less terrifying in the light of day. He went about his duties, checking the machinery, maintaining the light, and recording weather patterns. But the unease lingered, a constant weight pressing down on his chest. The lighthouse felt alive, its walls creaking and groaning as if responding to his movements. And then there was the sea. always there, surrounding him, vast and endless. It was mesmerizing in its beauty, yet terrifying in its power. The waves crashed against the rocks below, sending up sprays of salt water that coated the lighthouse's windows with a fine mist. As the day wore on, the sky darkened with storm clouds, casting an eerie twilight over the island. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the stonework, creating an unsettling symphony of noises that filled the lighthouse. Jack found himself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a face peering in from the storm outside. He cursed himself for letting his imagination get the better of him. But then, as evening approached and he lit the lantern once more, the unease crept back with a vengeance. The whispers started earlier this time, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. They floated in on the wind, barely audible at first, a series of murmurs that set his nerves on edge. This time, he refused to ignore them. Grabbing a flashlight, he made his way outside, determined to find the source of the voices. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet as he stepped out onto the narrow ledge that encircled the lantern room. The sea below churned violently, waves crashing against the cliffs, sending up sprays of foam. He circled the lighthouse, peering into the stormy darkness. There was nothing, no sign of life, no figure lurking in the shadows, just the endless expanse of ocean and the screaming wind. But the whispers persisted. They seemed to swirl around him, carried by the wind, growing louder as if mocking his efforts to find them. Jack pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the sound. It was no use. The voices were inside his head now, repeating his name over and over, filling him with a cold, creeping dread. He stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut, and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving him in a silence that was almost worse. Jack spent the rest of the day in a haze of unease. Despite his attempts to focus on his tasks, the memory of the previous night lingered, gnawing at the edge of his sanity. As the evening approached, the sky grew darker, storm clouds gathering over the horizon. The wind picked up again, howling around the lighthouse and rattling the windows, filling the air with an electric charge. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers were somehow tied to the storm, as if the sea itself was conspiring to unnerve him. As dusk fell, he climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room, preparing for another long night. The storm outside intensified, rain pelting against the glass and thunder rumbling in the distance. With trembling hands, he turned on the light, watching as its beam pierced through the thickening darkness. It was a small comfort, a lone beacon of light amidst the chaotic storm. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough to keep the darkness at bay. No sooner had he settled into his chair than the whispering began again, louder this time. It seemed to seep through the walls, filling the room with a cold, haunting echo. Jack's skin prickled as he listened, trying to make sense of the sounds. There were multiple voices now, overlapping and distorted, forming a cacophony of disjointed words and phrases. He strained to hear, catching snippets: lost, deep, beware, return. His breath hitched as a chilling realization dawned on him. These were not just random whispers. They were warnings, desperate cries of those who had been lost to the sea, their souls trapped within the lighthouse's walls. The voices were not trying to scare him. They were trying to tell him something. Jack grabbed his flashlight and stood up, heart pounding. He couldn't stay in the lantern room any longer. It felt as if the shadows were closing in around him, suffocating him with their presence. He made his way down the staircase, the whispers following him, growing louder with each step. He moved quickly, descending to the lower levels of the lighthouse, where the darkness was even more oppressive. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the stone walls that seemed to pulse and shift in the dim light. As he reached the bottom, the whispers ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of foreboding. Jack shined his light around the storage room, eyes scanning the shadows for any movement. The room was cluttered with old maritime equipment, ropes, rusted tools, broken lanterns, all relics of the lighthouse's long and troubled history. In the corner, half buried under a pile of decaying cloth, he spotted something strange. a trapdoor. He approached it cautiously, his heart thudding in his chest. The trapdoor was old, its wood warped and covered in seaweed, as if it had been submerged for years. Jack knelt down and grasped the rusted handle, hesitating for a moment before pulling it open. A rush of cold, salty air hit his face, carrying with it the faint sound of waves crashing far below. He shone his flashlight into the opening, revealing a narrow, spiral staircase descending into the darkness. Jack stared into the black void of the trapdoor, his mind racing. He hadn't known about this passage. Why had it been hidden, buried under years of neglect? And more importantly, where did it lead? The whispers started again, faint and insistent, urging him forward. "Come down, see the truth." They echoed, sending chills down his spine. With a deep breath, he stepped onto the staircase, the metal creaking under his weight. The descent was harrowing. The stairs wound tightly, plunging him deeper into the bowels of the lighthouse. The air grew colder, more humid, each breath filling his lungs with the scent of salt and decay. The walls were slick with moisture, glistening in the flashlight's beam. He moved slowly, gripping the railing, the echo of his footsteps reverberating in the narrow space. As he descended further, the whispers grew louder, bouncing off the stone walls in a maddening chorus. Jack's grip tightened on the flashlight, his nerves stretched taut. His mind conjured images of shipwrecked sailors, their faces twisted in terror, lost to the ocean's depths. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was descending into a grave, a place where the souls of the lost lingered, waiting for someone to find them. After what felt like an eternity, the staircase ended abruptly, depositing him in a small, circular chamber. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. In the center of the room stood a large, rusted anchor, chained to the floor. Jack approached cautiously, his flashlight beam wavering as his hand shook. The whispers swirled around him, forming a vortex of sound that pressed in on his ears. He stepped closer to the anchor, the air growing colder with each step. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, filling his head with chaotic voices. Jack dropped to his knees, clutching his head, trying to block out the noise. And then, in the midst of the cacophony, he heard a single voice cut through, a calm, commanding voice that sent a wave of dread through him. "Release us," it said, the words clear and resonant. Jack looked up, his flashlight casting shadows that danced around the room. The anchor seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the chains rattling as if moved by an unseen force. The room vibrated, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter, casting an eerie blue light. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what the voice meant. The anchor was a prison, a weight holding something or someone, trapped within the lighthouse's depths. The souls of the lost sailors, those who had been drawn to the lighthouse and claimed by the sea, were bound here, unable to find peace. The lighthouse was more than just a beacon. It was a tomb, a place where the voices of the ocean's victims had been sealed. The realization hit Jack like a wave, knocking the air from his lungs. The lighthouse wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, a vessel for the souls of those it had ensnared over the years. The storms, the shipwrecks, the disappearances, it was all connected to this place. The lighthouse had been a silent witness to the tragedies it had caused, drawing in ships with its false light and then feeding on the souls of those it lured into the depths. As he knelt before the anchor, the room around him seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening and swirling in a chaotic dance. The whispers changed, becoming cries of anguish and anger. Faces appeared in the shadows, twisted in expressions of torment. Jack recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. They were all here, the lost sailors, the lighthouse keepers who had come before him, their spirits bound to the place that had claimed their lives. He stumbled backward, his eyes fixed on the anchor. The chain rattled again, a metallic clanging that echoed in the chamber. The light from his flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that moved like wraiths around the room. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. "Release us," the commanding voice demanded again, cutting through the noise. Jack knew what he had to do. His Mind screamed at him to turn back, to run, to escape the nightmare that had unfolded before him. But he couldn't. The lighthouse had drawn him here for a reason, had whispered to him through the wind and darkness. It wanted him to see, to understand, and now it demanded action. He had to break the chains that bound these souls, to free them from their eternal torment. With trembling hands, he reached for the chains, the metal cold and slick with moisture. As his fingers closed around the links, the whispers rose to a deafening pitch, filling his head with cries of pain and fear. Jack gritted his teeth, ignoring the terror that surged through him. He yanked on the chain, pulling with all his strength. The anchor shifted slightly, and the room shuddered, the symbols on the walls flaring with a blinding light. "Release us!" the voices screamed, their collective cry piercing through the air. Jack pulled harder, feeling the resistance give way as the chains snapped. The anchor tipped over with a loud crash, and the chamber was filled with a rush of wind, like the breath of the sea itself. The light from the symbols intensified, flooding the room with a blinding, cold glow. Jack covered his eyes, bracing himself against the force that swept through the chamber. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light dimmed, and the room fell silent. Jack lowered his hands, blinking against the darkness that now filled the space. The chains lay broken on the floor, the anchor toppled, its oppressive energy dissipating into the air. The shadows in the room faded, the faces disappearing into the gloom. The whispers, which had haunted him for nights on end, were gone. The air in the chamber grew still, and Jack could feel a weight lifting from his chest. The oppressive darkness that had hung over him since his arrival was finally dissipating. He stood there, panting, his heart still racing from the intensity of what had just transpired. The chains that had bound the anchor were broken, scattered across the floor like remnants of a shattered curse. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed something strange happening around him. The faint glow of the symbols on the walls started to soften, their harsh, ghostly blue transforming into a warm amber hue. It was as if the very stone of the lighthouse had begun to warm up, losing its centuries-old coldness. The air felt different, lighter, filled with a sense of peace that was absent before. Jack took a hesitant step back, his flashlight flickering as he moved. The shadows that had danced threateningly in the corners were now retreating, pulling away from the walls and floor like mist dissipating in the sunlight. The faces, once twisted in torment and anger, faded into nothingness, leaving behind an echo of tranquility. For the first time, he didn't feel eyes watching him from the darkness. He turned to leave the chamber, his legs shaky but propelled by an urgency to get out of the lighthouse's depths. As he ascended the spiral staircase, the temperature seemed to rise gradually, the chill of the underground chamber giving way to a more welcoming warmth. With each step, the oppressive aura of the lighthouse lessened, replaced by the soft hum of the wind outside and the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks. The storm that had raged earlier seemed to be calming, the winds now a gentle breeze that whispered around the structure rather than howled through it. Upon reaching the top, Jack pushed open the door to the lantern room. The fresh sea air hit his face, invigorating him and clearing the remnants of the chamber's gloom from his mind. The lighthouse's beam was steady, sweeping across the now calm ocean like a guardian. The sky had cleared, revealing a star-studded canvas, the storm clouds having receded into the distance. Everything felt different. Jack stepped out onto the narrow ledge, encircling the lantern room, gripping the railing as he looked out over the sea. The waves were now gentle, lapping against the rocks below with a rhythmic cadence. It was almost as if the ocean itself had been released from the storm's grip, mirroring the change within the lighthouse. The island, once shrouded in an aura of fear and darkness, now seemed peaceful under the moonlight. For a moment, Jack stood in silence, breathing in the cool, salty air. The whispers were gone, replaced by the soothing sounds of the sea and the wind. The sense of dread that had followed him since his arrival was lifting, leaving behind a feeling of calm and relief. He leaned against the railing, closing his eyes and allowing himself to absorb the quietness. It was over. The lighthouse had released its grip on him, and it seemed, on the souls it had imprisoned. In the back of his mind, He could still hear a faint echo of voices, but they were no longer cries of anguish. They were soft, like the sigh of a distant breeze. A final, collective sigh of release, as if the souls had found peace at last. Jack opened his eyes, glancing up at the lighthouse's lantern. It shone brightly, its light steady and unbroken. A true beacon guiding ships through the night. No longer a lure for destruction, but a genuine source of guidance and safety. Jack spent the remainder of the night sitting in the lantern room, watching the horizon. The fear that had gripped him earlier was now a memory, replaced by a deep sense of understanding. The lighthouse was not inherently evil. It had become a vessel for the sorrow and despair of the sea's victims over the centuries. It had needed someone to break the cycle, to acknowledge the torment and take the steps to end it. He thought of the voices, the faces in the shadows, and the anchor in the depths below. They were reminders of the ocean's power, the lives lost to its fury. But now, those souls had been set free, released from their eternal prison within the lighthouse's walls. The keeper's role had been fulfilled, not by merely tending to the light, but by confronting the darkness that had seeped into the very fabric of the building. As the first hints of dawn colored the horizon, Jack felt a surge of resolve. He knew he would not stay here. The lighthouse had been cleansed, its story written and now closed. It was time for him to leave, to carry the tale of what he had experienced to the world outside. But as he stood and stretched, he glanced back at the lighthouse's machinery, the Fresnel lens gleaming in the early light, and nodded in quiet respect. It would continue its duty, lighting the way for those at sea, now free of the shadows that had haunted it for so long. As the sun broke over the horizon, bathing the island in a warm, golden glow, Jack made his way down to the base of the lighthouse. The structure stood tall and silent, no longer ominous but instead solemn and dignified. He packed his belongings quickly, eager to leave the island behind yet strangely at peace with what had transpired. The whispers had fallen silent, the sense of foreboding that had greeted him upon his arrival now replaced by a calm stillness. Walking out onto the rocky shore where his boat awaited, he turned back for one last look. The lighthouse's whitewashed walls gleamed in the morning sun, the scars from centuries of storms visible but no longer haunting. Its beams swept the sea with a steady rhythm, a beacon of light and safety, no longer tainted by the voices of the lost. Jack boarded the boat and started the engine, steering away from the island. The waters were calm, the sky clear. As he glanced back, he saw the lighthouse standing watch over the sea, a silent sentinel. In that moment, he felt a sense of closure. The lighthouse had been a place of horror, a beacon for the damned. But now, it had been given a chance to simply be what it was meant to be, a guide, a light in the darkness. As the island grew smaller in the distance, Jack let out a sigh. His mind was still processing everything that had happened, every whisper, every shadow, every fear he had faced. He had been tested, forced to confront the darkness not just within the lighthouse, but within himself. And now, he was leaving, not as a broken man, but as one who had survived, who had seen the abyss and returned. The journey back to the mainland would be long, but he felt a weight lift with each passing wave. The lighthouse and its secrets were behind him, yet he carried its story with him. It was a tale he would tell, not as a mere ghost story, but as a testament to the resilience of light in the face of darkness. The haunted lighthouse was no longer a place of terror. It was now a monument to those lost to the sea, a reminder of the thin line between safety and peril, light and shadow. And as Jack sailed away, the whispers faded completely, leaving only the sound of the waves and the promise of a new beginning. If this story of the haunted lighthouse sent chills down your spine, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more tales of terror. Don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new haunting adventure. Have you ever visited a lighthouse that gave you an eerie feeling? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your own encounters with the unknown. If you enjoyed this tale, give us a thumbs up and let us know. Until next time, remember, when the sea whispers, listen, but don't follow.